We live in a time of global transformation. The Energy Futures podcast explores how we can accelerate the expansion of clean energy technologies and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. From heating and cooling our homes to moving around our planet and beyond, we bring together researchers, scientists, business leaders, and communicators to exchange knowledge and try to answer one important question. How can we create a sustainable energy future for all? This podcast is produced by Energy Futures Lab of Imperial College London.
Is carbon capture an investable industry and can it be financeable? Today's episode is hosted by Dr. Nadine Moustafa, a research associate at Imperial, specialising in carbon management and decarbonisation technologies. Her guest today is Paul Davies, an independent advisor in infrastructure and government and NED, ESG and CCS advisor to Viridor. He is a director at CO2, the Severnside Carbon Capture and Shipping Hub, and the Director Coalition for Negative Emissions. Paul specialises in large complex transactions for the private sector, focusing on models of how business and government can work together. His current work focuses on non-pipeline carbon transfer. In this episode, they discuss government's role in financing decarbonisation, the public and private sector contributions to decarbonisation industries, innovation in carbon capture lending itself to investment, policies and markets.
Welcome everyone to today's episode in Energy Futures podcast. We will be talking today about financing decarbonisation. And I'm Nadine Moustafa. I'm a research associate at Imperial College London. I'm based both in the Chemical Engineering Department and the Centre for Environmental Policy. I'm joined today by Paul Davies, and I'll let you introduce yourself if that's okay.
Hi everyone, Paul Davies. I sort of wear various hats, but I'm a long-term infrastructure financier and advisor to government. And in the last decade or so, heavily involved in carbon capture and carbon removals. So that's my background. I currently chair a cluster for carbon capture called CO2 for the west of England, and I chair the Coalition for Negative Emissions, which is an industry group looking at carbon removals.
Thanks for that, and it's so nice to have you here. And I think just to set the scene and start this out, one of the questions I think is, so what makes financing decarbonisation different to, business as usual infrastructure? How is it that when we finance decarbonisation or decarbonisation technologies, how is that different from financing something that we do usually?
Well, a lot of the risks are the same. So, what's the capital cost? What's the operating cost? Can we get certainty? So the technical risks are no different than any other sector you're looking at. The big difference for decarbonisation is about revenue. If you're financing, let's say, a new road, you do a toll road or a new airport or aviation, the revenue is there. It's the revenue from your users. The trouble with decarbonisation is there is no revenue. Decarbonising, it's a waste product. CO2 is a waste product. And at the moment, we're not charging anyone for disposing that waste. That's the problem. There is no cost. So what you need is something that creates that revenue for doing that investment. Because at the moment, if you invested in it, what's your return? Because no one's willing to pay. Where that leads you to is two things. Having government models at the beginning that support and give a level of grant and government support to create that revenue, to make projects investable. And in the longer term, a carbon price. So in other words, a price that you will not have to pay if you decarbonise that makes it worth investing. And that's the challenge, is getting to a carbon price which is high enough to make it investable, or in the short term relying on government for support to square the circle to make it profitable.
And so you've already kind of mentioned the challenges that make something investable, right? Like how do we make it investable from a private financier's perspective? Yes. And so I just wanted to ask, based on that, how do you think that, because you also mentioned the government and you mentioned the private sector, sorry. So based on that, how do you see them collaborating to make those projects investable and financeable in the short term, right now, basically?
Yeah. So when you finance a project, you typically finance through two key things: equity, which are the real risk takers of the project, and most of it will be financed by debt, by banks. They are not big risk takers. Most banks, funnily enough, they want to get repaid. And so they will look for a structure which is quite contractually fixed and quite low risk. So you will have a fixed price contract to deliver the project from some big contractor. So you already know the cost of the project, and probably something the same for the operating costs. So you already know those. You know your cost of finance because the banks tell you. So the only missing bit then is the revenue. And at the moment, what's happening is government is offering contracts, they're called contracts for differences, that they give a fixed price above the costs that mean I know I can repay my finance, both the debt to the banks and a return to the investors. So what that is what the private sector is good at doing is doing the detailed engineering and then getting those fixed price contracts in place to reduce the risk of the project. But what they need from government is the certainty over the revenue, so that agreement of what the price is. And it's that public-private partnership that makes all this work.
And I guess that changes with time, right? Like the risk you're taking was not the same throughout. And so the public and private sector's contribution to, financing these projects from the beginning to the end will change with time. I envision that probably government has a bigger contribution initially.
Yes, that's right. But for a couple of reasons. The first one is, as we get better at doing this, the price should come down. And I'll give you a good example of where this worked magnificently well. So in the wind sector, the government gave exactly those same contracts for differences. So they gave a guaranteed price for you to build and finance a wind farm and get repaid. And it was quite a high price. It was like 180 pence per kilowatt or something. It was that sort of level. Over time, competition and innovation, we are now at less than a quarter of that price, to the extent that wind power is now more competitive than fossil fuel energy. The result is that the first deals, the government had to effectively give quite a lot of subsidy in that price. But as the price has come down, government still gives those contracts because that gives you revenue certainty. But actually the subsidy, the actual grant from government in those contracts is now zero. That's, if you like, what we should be all aiming for across all of our industries. So in carbon capture and storage, we want to push the price down so that the level of support we need from government comes to zero. And then one other factor, which is in some of our sectors, in carbon capture, for instance, we are beginning to produce what's called negative emissions. So it's when you are capturing carbon dioxide that has come from the atmosphere, not from fossil fuels. So, for instance, bioenergy, when you're burning sustainable biomass, or direct air capture, where you're actually sucking it out of the air and through a chemical process taking in the CO2. When we do that, we've actually created what's called a negative emission. That's beginning to have a monetary value. The companies will buy that emission to offset their residual emissions. And that market is just the beginning of becoming a $1 trillion market, a massive market. That will provide the revenue to finance those projects, meaning, again, the government contribution can quite quickly disappear. And ideally, the best position is government just goes back and says, over to you guys, and then we do the rest.
But do you see, so just by explaining the difference of CCS, carbon capture and storage, but also carbon removal from atmosphere and like producing those negative emissions. But do you see, so just by explaining the difference of CCS, carbon capture and storage, but also carbon removal from atmosphere and like producing those negative emissions, have you seen any kind of lessons that we might be able to use to build those financeable business models?
Yeah, I mean, the lessons actually, we've done this well in other sectors, so it's reapplying. So, I mean, I chaired a group for the CCS industry recommending the business models to government. And we didn't come up with a new one. We said these two models work. So what we did for the carbon capture for the emitters was this contracts for difference. We said we've done it already in wind, we've done it in solar, let's just do it again. Why is it called a contract for difference, by the way, is a simple thing, which is the government pays you the overall price, but it takes away the price in the wind farms of the electricity that you get from the market for producing electricity, which may be not as high as the price government pays, hence they just pay the difference. In carbon capture, they pay a price less the carbon tax you would have paid if they hadn't done the project. So that's why it's called a contract for difference. So we use the same model. The other part of what we're doing in carbon capture is the storage. So companies are now setting up what's called the transport and storage companies. They are taking the CO2 and piping it into long-term geological storage, basically putting it back from whence it came to stay there hopefully for millions of years. That is a structure which we've done on a business model called the regulated asset base. So all the UK utilities, that sort of power sector, water, telecoms, are on a regulated structure where a very low cost of capital and a regulator making sure prices are keen. We've just said that works elsewhere. Investors like it. We do exactly the same for those T&S companies, the first ones, because they were relatively high risk, relatively monopolistic because they are sort of your only provider in a region, and they need to grow incrementally. So we just created a business model, again, that we've used time and time again. So it's a new sector, but actually the business models and the finance is exactly the same as it has been for wind and solar and power and telecoms.
And I mean, I'll come back to the infrastructure part because I think scaling infrastructure across the country is
always fun.
Obviously, has a lot of challenges. But within, so I just want to ask again about like the carbon capture and storage projects. Because obviously it requires a lot of upfront cost. You need those long-term business models for investors and the industry to feel like it's worth investing in it. And as you mentioned, you need this carbon price, you need things like the emission trading scheme and so on. But we haven't seen, large-scale carbon capture and storage projects come up the way we thought they would, especially with the emission trading scheme. And so what challenges do you see that are in carbon capture and storage, for example, when compared to wind and solar? Is it more from the public perception, do you think, or is it the business model?
No, it's the business. It's a scale issue. Okay. I actually was advising government, 15 years ago now, when government started to try and do carbon capture, stopped at the time because they just said we haven't got the budget. Famously, our Prime Minister said, let's do less of this green crap, which is a quote which he's probably not proud of. But anyway, the issue that we were struggling with, I'll call it cross-chain risk. If you think of a carbon capture project, you'll have a big project with an emitter. So let's take, I'm advising an energy from waste company, Viridor. It's maybe £1 billion project for 1 million tonnes a year. Then you've got a big pipeline you've got to build. And then you've got to be able to pipe it to a store and be confident that the store can contain, with no leakage, that CO2. Each of those is a big, quite risky project by itself. So the challenge you've had with the early projects is that's a lot of risk, project on project risk that the industry calls it. So what we've had to do to make that financeable is break it down into pocket-sized chunks that are financeable. And basically that's why we've got the CFD for the emitter. So the emitter just focuses on, can I build and capture that CO2? And the CFD pays for it to its gate. Once it gets it to its gate, job done. That's financeable. It's a one self-contained project. And then we got the second project we are financing that is the transport and the storage. And that again has been financed separately. What's too much for the private sector at this early stage in a new sector is to finance it all together. It's too one riskier project. What that does mean is government has had one critical role, and it's called cross-chain risk. So if you're financing an emitter project, it's great, and you've done everything, and you're ready, and you get to your gate. What happens if the transport and storage doesn't work? Well, the answer is you're stuck. You've captured the CO2, and you'd have to vent it again. And similarly, if you spend on the transport and storage, but the emitter fails, I've got a wonderful storage with nothing to put in it. So what government has done is said, we will guarantee you each so that if one is underperforming, we keep you whole. So at an early, complicated stage, there is a fundamental role of government to help make that happen. In the longer term, once these things are established, government can go away. And this is, again, things like, sorry to mention it, but in the oil and gas industry, say liquid natural, LNG. That's sort of what happened. We had big structured deals contractually very fixed in the early days. Now people just turn up and, with a shipload of LNG, and there's much more what's called a merchant market because we're confident the infrastructure is there to support us. So the big difference with big infrastructure is you need that level of government support to kick it off. And that's why we've got these public-private partnerships.
And the government has already kind of pledged to make sure that...
Absolutely, more than that. So we have now just done financial close, it's called, or FID, people say FID, which is the final investment decision, I think, on the two first clusters. So one is on the East Coast, and that's been a financial close both on the transport and storage and on the underlying power project that will feed its CO2. And on the West Coast, what's called HyNet, it's the Eni, which is the Italian state-owned oil company, has just done financial close on the store, and that's quickly going to get followed by financial close on the key emitters that are going to feed into that store. So close has happened. We are now into the beginning of build and rollout. So it's taken a while to get there. I've been on this for 15 years, but that's 22 billion of expenditure government has been committing to support those two areas.
Okay, that's, good. I like having optimistic things in the episodes. And I usually end with that, like, this is optimistic. We're doing all of this, but these are the challenges and we need to kind of figure those out.
In infrastructure, I'd say you need two things. You need optimism, so I'm definitely a glass half full person, and you need tenacity because things take much longer than any of us think is needed.
And speaking of that, actually, so I think I said I'd get back to this, so the infrastructure part. So maybe we should start with, we've already talked about the capture part. We've also kind of touched upon the transport and storage part. But then, relating to your work on non-pipeline CO2 transport, maybe we should start with kind of explaining, why there's non-pipeline and then there's the pipeline.
Yeah. So government has started with the easy wins, which is there's a couple of bits of infrastructure at existing, I'll call them clusters, so areas of big industrial output. They, by chance, are near to existing infrastructure and existing geological storage. So HyNet, the West Coast one, for instance, actually there's an existing pipeline to a disused oil and gas field, which sadly I financed in the 80s, but they are reusing that. And so the industries that are there are just lucky enough to be next to those pipelines. That's the easy wins. For the majority of the big emitters around the country, they're not near there. So what we have to solve for them to decarbonise is what's called non-pipeline transport, i.e. getting the CO2 to the store without a pipeline. So I'm now championing that because it's the next stage. So as I say, I chair a cluster down in Avonmouth at Bristol. We've got sort of 5 to 8 million tonnes per year of emissions from regional emitters. What can they do? How can they decarbonise? Well, the answer is they will decarbonise through carbon capture and either pipe it or rail it locally to our terminal. We will then put it on ships and ship it to storage. So non-pipeline transport is all about effectively the 80% of companies not lucky enough to be at a pipeline, making sure they can decarbonise as well. And they are quite different because the pipelines are large pieces of infrastructure which we will slowly fill. So quite heavy upfront costs. So whilst that cost is allocated to the first few people, it's quite expensive. But in the long term, once you fill the pipeline, it will get cheaper. At non-pipeline storage, you do the opposite. You build the infrastructure relative to the size of the emissions you're capturing. So you don't build 20 ships when you only need 2. You build 2 and then a third one, then a fourth and a fifth as you get more and more emitters. So the cost is hopefully lower and the upfront capital much lower, but they are servicing different needs. So that's why I'm championing non-pipeline transport, is to make sure those clusters that aren't by pipeline can be successful and regions can decarbonise.
And I think generally people will ask, should we be focusing on those small modular solutions rather than investing in those mega projects? And I'm a huge believer in there's no silver bullet, and I think anyone that has seen any of the other episodes, I always say this. But what are your thoughts?
Well, obviously the answer is both, but the way I would describe it is this, which is government has limited money. And unfortunately with net zero, we all think it's the most important thing ever, but government also have things like the NHS and the odd war or two to deal with. So net zero will always be, the poor cousin when allocating money. So we will always want and need more money. Where I think the government should focus the limited money it's got is, I'll call it enabling infrastructure. So if you've got, you've built the pipeline, do you give support to 20 more projects at that pipeline to fill it? I'd say no, because the government's job is to create that enabling infrastructure. It's got the pipeline going. What I think it should then prioritise is elsewhere in the UK, where do we get enabling infrastructure? So, for instance, if they finance a couple of projects down at my hub at Bristol, we build the hub. That means another 10, 15 companies can then use that hub. So what I'd say to government is use your limited money wisely and think of your role as not quick success, but building the infrastructure that the industry will finance without you in the 2030s and 2040s. So that's what I'd say. You do need both pipeline and non-pipeline, but make sure you've created that enabling infrastructure.
That starting infrastructure. But then that will go hand in hand with, let's say, long-term policy signals, just so that companies then start investing in those. Yeah. So you'd say that that's quite important as well.
Well, absolutely, because if you start from the premise which I have, which is government has limited money to help decarbonisation, where that takes you to is government needs to focus on helping the policies develop that mean we can do it without government money. First and foremost, that's carbon price. And at the moment, the carbon price is too low to make this economic. But over time, that will increase. But also regulations. So, for instance, in some industries, regulating the carbon content will force them to do these sorts of things. And also not killing your industries while you do it. So there's what's called a cross-border adjustment mechanism. So if we are charging a carbon price to our steel and our glass production, and we are importing steel from countries that don't impose it, they'll be cheaper. So what the whole of Europe, including UK, is doing is also a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a CBAM, which sounds like an 80s pop group, but anyway, imposing a CBAM to make it a level playing field. Because otherwise all we'll do is impose tax on our own companies and they'll all close down. So policy, in my mind, is more and more important, not subsidy, because we haven't got much money, but we can do policy free.
And I mean, speaking of CBAM, so the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, I love having those episodes where we mention something and I'm like, that would be good for a future episode. Like, we need to talk about the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. But then I know you've advised on various industries, so aviation, waste, and so on. And in your views, did you see that, one of those industries is quite well placed to finance their decarbonisation? Some of them maybe not so much?
Yeah. So it goes back to my first point, which is about revenue. Those industries that can create their own revenue are the more likely to accelerate. So let me give you examples. If you're in, say, steel, and you're competing with people who are not paying carbon, it's not easy. But if you're in, let's say, bioenergy, where when you burn biomass, and you capture it and put it in the ground, you've created that negative emission, people will pay for that. And at the moment, you're seeing some sort of leading projects in the US paying $600 a tonne for some of that negative emissions. That's in an industry where maybe the average cost is $200. So biomass and anything that creates greenhouse gas removals or negative emissions or carbon removals, lots of people use different terms, there's one sector. Go to another one, the aviation. Aviation, ultimately, we know how much CO2 we emit when we fly anywhere. So if you do a trip to New York, it's about a ton of CO2 that you are emitting personally. And that's economy, by the way. If you fly business, Nadine, then a lot more. But anyway, therefore, there's a known price that we could start charging customers, or at least, in my mind, inviting them to contribute to, so that the aviation can start to buy offsetting removals or pay for what's called sustainable aviation fuel, which is fuel actually that carbon capture will help create. So there's a sector where you could create much more voluntary demand. And at the moment, if you go and book an airline ticket, it'll sell you the ticket. It'll immediately ask you, do you want a hotel? Do you want a car? Do you want insurance? In my mind, before all of those, it should say, do you want to do some carbon removals to offset? And do you want to offset 10%, 50%, 100%, 200%? And give consumers the choice. At the moment, that's nowhere. In the next 10 years, I'd want that to be just, seeing it all the time. That would give the aviation industry money that they can spend directly on those types of carbon removal projects. And that's what we need for the scale of removals needed.
That's super interesting, because I think a lot of individuals, for example, will go and look for projects to, offset their emissions from aviation, but they won't necessarily know, which projects are good or which projects are bad. Yes. And so I think, having the aviation industry actually put that option where they've done their due diligence, and obviously there's a lot of episodes about, we have a couple of episodes about carbon removal and also one about carbon markets, and it's quite complicated, but if the aviation industry acts as this middleman, and they do the due diligence instead of letting the individual consumer kind of figure it out, that would
and to be fair to the industry, they have so if you go on to British Airways website, and when you're booking flights, if you dig and put in carbon removals, they are buying carbon removals, and you can do exactly what you've said. And they're charging about 80 quid a tonne, and they actually describe it's a balance of some nature-based removals, as well as some direct air capture and some engineered. So they've done precisely that. I think that all I'm saying is make it more and more in your face.
Okay.
And part of the reason, which is a bit ironic, which is the aviation industry is actually being challenged for some of their offsets and removals, making it more difficult for them to promote the very things we say they should be doing. Yeah. So I'm not sort of dissing them at all. They are trying to do the right thing. Let's make it easy for them to be more and more vocal. But going back to your original question, those are two sectors where you can see greater amount of revenue coming from consumers, from the customers, that can pay for those projects. Where that's the case, they're more likely to go ahead. So greenhouse gas removals, bioenergy, direct air capture, sustainable aviation fuel, which is using effectively captured CO2, biogenic CO2. Those are the ones that I think will accelerate. And to give you an idea of the scale, for carbon removals, for instance, the IPCC estimates we need about 5 billion tonnes per annum of carbon removals by 2050. So, a scale of industry just inconceivable at this stage. That we will only have a prayer of getting to that level if we start aggressively now.
Yeah, and just for our listeners, the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so, you've mentioned all these different sectors, and we kind of talked about them individually. I just wanted to ask, do you see that there's any cross-sector financing mechanisms, or should we be focusing on sector-specific financing mechanisms? Because, it can be both, I think.
Yeah. Well, some of the policies we're talking about are cross-sector. So if you've got a carbon price, that's going to be helping you in glass as much as energy from waste to bioenergy. So we're encouraging governments to enable, at the moment it's quite difficult to export and import CO2 between ourselves and Europe, for instance. Let's make that policy work. That will be important for storage, for European companies can come and use the cheap storage, because the UK has an abundance of geological storage. So some of those policy barriers, and that would help all of the sectors. So a lot of this is cross-sector. I think the other thing which is interesting, which is, I'll take this example. If I am capturing CO2, what's called biogenic, so from biomass, for instance. So when you burn wood, and actually the energy from waste plants, 50% of the waste that we all produce is biogenic. It's from paper and food waste, etc. That's CO2 that's come from the atmosphere. So if you capture that and put it in the ground, that's your negative emission. So that's effectively the industry that can make all that work. What's interesting is when you've got that biogenic, you have two choices. I could either put it in the ground, in which case someone will pay me for a negative emission, or I could use that CO2 and mix it with hydrogen that we can produce with electrolysis, and you create sustainable aviation fuel. There's a bit of a process in there, but effectively you could use that biogenic CO2 either for a negative emission or for, in short, it's called SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel. So what you want is a market that quickly can move between them and respond to economic signals to make the best use and the most economically advantageous use of your biogenic CO2. So the markets aren't like little pockets here and there. They should be joined up and thinking and talking to each other to make it, ultimately decarbonising is expensive and we want to make it as cheap as possible.
Yeah, and I think maybe just kind of given that everything we've said today, what do you think we should be thinking more of or less of when we think about financing decarbonisation?
Probably more of is enabling policies, and then from the private sector side, a greater focus on decarbonisation. So recently, a lot of, I think it's about 7,000 companies sign up to what's called a SBTI, which is science-based, I've forgotten what the T&I stand, targets in English, thank you, which is declaring and reporting on their moves towards net zero. And the SBTI has just changed its guidance to say you need to think about not only your route to net zero, which is investing in decarbonising, but also you will have residual emissions. You need to start buying removals at scale to compensate that. So the private sector needs to think more and more, and it becoming absolutely just commonplace that you have a net zero strategy in place, and within that, a strategy for buying residual offsets for your residual emissions.
Yeah, and I think just for our listeners, again, just to kind of, so when it comes to residual emissions, what we mean by that is that once you've basically done all of your reduction opportunities, so let's say your company starts with 100 tons of CO2 emitted, you need to try and do everything first to reduce your emissions. So let's say switching to renewable energy, for example, and so on. And then in the end, there's going to be this last certain percentage that's quite hard to that's quite hard to reduce using like substitute technologies. That's what we would define as residual emissions. And usually people would, define that as what's economically makes more sense to remove rather than reduce. Because once you're at a certain percentage, it's a bit more expensive.
Exactly. It's called the hard to abate emissions. Yeah. Basically, there are some things we do which are just either too expensive to stop doing, or just you can't capture them. So that's from people that heating their homes who are not connected to a network will still have to burn some fossil fuels or wood or whatever it might be, to industries. Some industrial process like making cement, making glass, inherently produces some CO2 as part of the process. You can't avoid it. So if you can't capture it and you can't avoid it, you will need to offset it. And so that's what, it's the net in net zero. The reason we don't say we're heading towards zero, but net zero, is the recognition that we will need some removals to compensate for the bits that we can't avoid. And actually my prediction with flying probably will carry on, and fossil fuels will be used well into the next century, but that will only be permissible if we have removals to compensate. Because like it or dislike it, fossil fuels are an extremely efficient capture of energy. That's why we use it so readily, and there will be some uses where absolutely it's essential, but we'll just more and more just have to completely offset whenever we do use it.
Yeah, and I think, again, we have a couple of episodes on energy storage where we talk about the challenges of that, storing electrons versus just storing it in a fossil fuel form, which is like a chemical form, basically. It's so much harder. And so I think I have one fun question, one practical question. So for all of the listeners that we have today, whether it's from industry or financiers or government, what would you tell them, or what would your advice be about what they should be doing, or what should they be thinking about when it comes to financing the decarbonization?
Yeah, so it is all about, I suppose it's this consistent message of creating a level of demand and certainty that makes this investable. And that's from driving down the cost to make it as cheap as possible, putting in the contractual structures to make it predictable, and focusing on revenue. How do we make sure we know we're going to get the revenue to pay for these projects? And that's a mixture of good policy, carbon pricing, and support from companies that need to start buying offsets for their own businesses. And it's that marriage between companies needing offsets, companies looking to develop, and government trying to promote policy that working together to create that certainty to make this investable. Because if one of those three equations doesn't work, if you haven't got the demand, if you haven't got price certainty, and if you haven't got revenue certainty, no one invests. So it's a lot of integrated work, close policy, and the private sector being encouraged to do the right thing.
Yeah, and I think that comes up a lot, the fact that, the different stakeholders need to collaborate and think together and do this together, and ASAP, basically, because, our targets are quite close by. And so my final question, if you had a magic wand to unlock investment, where would you wave it? Whether it's maybe a decision that could happen tomorrow, or it could be that, you want to have millions or billions, actually in this case, of pounds to invest somewhere. Where would that be?
Well, obviously my own prejudice thing, because I'm working on doing non-pipeline transport, is the magic wand would be spending it in those enabling infrastructure. I suppose we were that side. But I think it's unfortunately a more complex answer to your question, because the magic wand I could say is carbon price, because clearly at the moment it's not economic to do the waste disposal. Yeah. So the carbon price should make it economic. But the thing it's got to be quite a big magic wand, because in doing that, we've also got to think about how that impacts people. There's a cost to this. Things like fuel poverty, what does it mean to consumer goods? So the magic wand also needs to think about the impacts on the population. And something that's quite worrying recently is that there has been a political consensus on net zero until recently. And you'll have seen politically suddenly that consensus has broken down from the right wing and Reform, etc., challenging this, which I think is scientifically moronic, but that is where they happen to be. It is clear that if the cost of net zero is falling on people, and in particular we're not thinking of the consequences, it will become politically toxic. So the magic wand carbon price, that's a banker talking about what I need to finance projects. We also need to, how do we make this as socially acceptable as possible, that we make it a just transition and think about the consequences, because otherwise we'll lose the political support, and without the political support, none of this will happen.
I love that answer, just because we talk a lot about this again from our perspectives, right? Like I talk about it as an engineer or scientist, and a lot of the time it's a bit hard to think beyond the lab or the pilot scale, or even beyond the industry, where we talk about the general public and how that will affect them. And that discussion is definitely something we should be having more of.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
But that will be for a future episode. But no, thank you so much for joining us today. And
pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you for tuning in to the Energy Futures podcast. Here at Energy Futures Lab, we are dedicated to addressing global energy challenges through pioneering research, innovation, and advocacy. To learn more about us and the exciting projects we are working on, visit our website and follow us on social media. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and share, and subscribe to stay up to date with our latest content. Until next time, stay curious.